Karoline Leavitt adjusted the delicate gold cross resting just above her collarbone as she settled into her first-class seat, unaware that a confrontation was moments away. The hum of the boarding passengers filled the cabin, the occasional chime of a flight attendant's announcement cutting through the ambient noise. It was supposed to be just another flight, a routine trip in the middle of her packed schedule, but as she glanced toward the front of the cabin, she noticed a flight attendant making her way down the aisle. There was something about the woman's expression, stiff, deliberate, with a forced politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes, that made Karoline straighten her posture instinctively. The attendant stopped at her row, offering a practiced smile that felt more like a formality than a genuine greeting. At first, Karoline assumed this was simply the usual first-class service, maybe an offer of a drink or a menu before takeoff, but the woman's eyes weren't on her face. They were locked on her necklace. "Miss, we like to keep the atmosphere welcoming for everyone," the attendant said, her tone light but laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. "Some passengers might find that a bit inappropriate." Karoline blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me?" she asked, unsure if she had misheard. The flight attendant's expression didn't change. If anything, her smile became more rigid, more rehearsed. "We just try to avoid displays that could make others uncomfortable." Karoline's gaze dropped to the small gold cross resting against her blouse. A display? It was a necklace, nothing more. She looked back up at the attendant, searching her face for any sign that this was a mistake, that she was being singled out for some other reason. But the slight tension in the woman's posture told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about airline policy. This wasn't about keeping peace on the flight. It was about something else entirely. A quiet hush had already settled over the surrounding passengers, a few stealing glances over the tops of their phones. Karoline knew the signs. This was the moment people started recording. "You're telling me that wearing a cross is making people uncomfortable?" Karoline's voice was clear, unwavering, but she made sure to keep her tone even. The flight attendant didn't waver. "I'm just asking for cooperation, Miss Leavitt." And there it was, the name drop. The intentional confirmation that this was not a misunderstanding, not a random enforcement of some obscure airline rule. This woman knew exactly who she was talking to. This wasn't about a necklace. It was about making a statement, about drawing a line in the sand. Karoline sat up straighter, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "Are you saying religious jewelry is against airline policy?" The attendant hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough for Karoline to catch it. "It's not about policy," she finally said. Karoline's jaw tightened. "It's about what, exactly?" The woman opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't done. "Because it sounds like you're singling me out for wearing a cross." A subtle shift rippled through the cabin. A man in business class leaned slightly over his seat, whispering to the person next to him. Another passenger 3 rows back lowered their phone just enough to steady the camera. This wasn't just a quiet exchange anymore. It was a moment, one that people were paying attention to. From somewhere in the back of the cabin, a soft chime rang out. Someone had pressed the call button for assistance. The tension in the air thickened, a slow building awareness settling over the first-class section. Karoline could feel it now, the weight of what was happening. The moment when something that should have been personal, should have been insignificant, was being made into a public spectacle. The flight attendant's composure wavered for the first time. "Look, I'm just trying to keep this from becoming a problem," she said, shifting slightly as if she had already realized she was losing control of the situation. "If you could just—" A voice from 2 rows back interrupted her. "She's right," the man said, his voice firm but controlled. "You wouldn't say this to someone wearing another religious symbol." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. The flight crew had noticed the disruption now, and a second flight attendant, this one wearing the stripes of a lead supervisor, approached with a measured pace. She glanced between her colleague and Karoline, her expression neutral but observant, assessing the situation with a careful calculation. "What seems to be the issue?" the supervisor asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Before Karoline could respond, the first flight attendant spoke up, her tone clipped but controlled. "Miss Leavitt's necklace is causing discomfort for some passengers." A pause. The supervisor's gaze flicked to the small gold cross and back to the flight attendant. There was no immediate reaction, no sign of agreement or disapproval, just a brief moment of quiet contemplation. But in that moment, Karoline saw it. The subtle calculation, the realization that this was already spiraling beyond control. A camera phone just barely peeking over a seatback was capturing everything. Karoline Leavitt sat perfectly still, her posture firm, her hands resting lightly on the armrest as she held the flight attendant's gaze. The murmurs in the cabin had not faded. If anything, they were growing, a low hum of uncertainty and quiet outrage threading through the passengers. The tension was thick now, an almost tangible force in the confined space of first class. She could see the flicker of hesitation in the flight attendant's eyes, the way she shifted ever so slightly, as if already regretting pushing this far. But that hesitation didn't come with an apology or a retraction. Instead, she doubled down. "Miss Leavitt," she said, the forced politeness in her voice straining under the weight of the moment, "this is not a request meant to be personal. We are simply trying to maintain a neutral environment for all passengers." Karoline exhaled slowly, the absurdity of the statement settling into her mind. A neutral environment? Wasn't that just another way of saying erased? Because that's what this was. An attempt to erase something visible, something undeniable. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "So, just to be clear," Karoline said, her voice steady but firm, "you are asking me to remove my necklace because some unidentified passengers might feel uncomfortable with me wearing a cross." She let the words hang in the air, forcing the weight of them to settle in, not just for the flight attendant, but for everyone listening. More eyes turned toward them. The hushed conversations around the cabin grew more focused. The flight attendant hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly on the tray she held. She knew she was losing control of the situation, but she wasn't willing to let it go just yet. "It's not about the necklace, Miss Leavitt," she tried again, her voice softer now, as if she could make the moment disappear by shifting tactics. "It's about creating a comfortable space for all passengers." Karoline let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head slightly. "A comfortable space?" she repeated, tilting her head. "For who, exactly? Because I'm sitting here, minding my own business, wearing something I wear every day, and suddenly I'm the problem? Would you say the same thing if someone was wearing a hijab, a Star of David?" She leaned in just slightly, not threatening but commanding, making sure every word landed where it needed to. "Would you ask them to remove it?" The flight attendant stiffened, her expression faltering for the first time. That was the breaking point. The moment when she realized she had stepped into something much bigger than she had anticipated. She had expected resistance, maybe even some frustration, but she had not expected to be challenged so directly, so publicly. Before she could answer, someone a few seats over spoke up. "She's right," the voice said, firm and clear. A man in his mid-50s, dressed in a sharp suit, turned in his seat to face the flight attendant. "Would you have said this to anyone else? Or is it just because she's Christian?" The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. The moment was no longer just between Karoline and the flight attendant. It belonged to everyone in the room now. A woman in the row ahead of her turned slightly, murmuring to her companion. Another passenger, a few rows back, pulled out their phone, the glow of the screen illuminating their face as they tilted it just enough to record. The weight of the moment had expanded beyond the immediate confrontation, morphing into something larger, something unavoidable. Karoline stayed exactly where she was, unmoving, watching as the flight attendant's composure cracked. The forced smile was gone now, replaced by something closer to frustration, or was it fear? She knew she had miscalculated. She had expected quiet compliance, maybe some grumbling resistance, but not this. Not this level of pushback, not with an audience. The supervisor arrived then, her stride controlled but urgent, her gaze sweeping between Karoline and the flight attendant before settling on the small gold cross that had started it all. The murmurs in the cabin quieted just slightly, the passengers waiting to see what would happen next. The supervisor's face remained unreadable as she turned to her colleague. "What seems to be the issue?" The flight attendant's voice was tight, clipped now as she tried to explain. "Miss Leavitt's necklace is causing discomfort for some passengers." A pause. The kind of silence that feels heavy, stretching longer than it actually is. Then, the supervisor's gaze flicked to Karoline, then back to the flight attendant. Her next words were careful, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. "She's welcome to wear her necklace." And just like that, the fight was over. The flight attendant blinked, the finality of the words settling in. Her face paled slightly and her lips pressed into a thin, rigid line as she exhaled sharply. She opened her mouth as if about to protest, but something in the supervisor's expression stopped her. There would be no further argument. She had lost. Around them, the cabin responded in its own way. A few passengers murmured their approval, some shaking their heads in disbelief that this had even been an issue in the first place. A voice across the aisle muttered, "Unbelievable." Another, sharper, "If she weren't conservative, would this even be happening?" The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a statement. The supervisor turned to Karoline, her voice measured, professional. "Apologies for any misunderstanding, Miss Leavitt. You're free to wear your cross." But the damage had already been done. Karoline didn't need an apology. She had already won. The murmurs in the cabin had grown into something more than just idle whispers. This was a moment teetering on the edge of full-scale confrontation. Karoline Leavitt remained composed, her posture unshaken, but she could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the tension thickening in the confined space of first class. The flight attendant who had confronted her just moments ago stood stiffly, her once polished demeanor fraying at the edges. She had expected compliance, perhaps an irritated sigh followed by quiet submission, but instead she had found resistance. Not just from Karoline, but now from the passengers around them, who had quickly picked up on the glaring double standard. The air was charged, expectant. The silence wasn't passive, it was the kind that demanded a resolution. And that was when the supervisor arrived. She moved with calculated control, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s, uniform crisp, expression unreadable, paused just a few steps from Karoline's seat, her gaze flickering between her colleague and the now visibly engaged passengers. Unlike the first attendant, whose authority had begun to slip the moment her request was challenged, this woman understood the gravity of the situation. She knew this was no longer about a single passenger and a simple necklace. This was a public relations nightmare in real time. "What seems to be the issue?" The supervisor's voice was steady, neutral, but there was a sharpness to it, the tone of someone who already knew that whatever she was about to hear was going to require damage control. Before Karoline could respond, the first flight attendant jumped in, her voice quick, defensive. "Miss Leavitt's necklace is causing discomfort for some passengers." She said it with the kind of forced professionalism that barely masked the irritation underneath. A last-ditch effort to reclaim control of the situation before it spiraled further out of reach. The supervisor's gaze shifted. For the first time, she actually looked at the necklace in question, a delicate gold cross, unassuming, barely larger than a fingertip. Her expression betrayed nothing, but the pause that followed was enough to confirm what Karoline already knew. This wasn't policy. This wasn't about actual passenger complaints. This was personal. And now it had escalated into something far beyond what the first attendant had intended. The flight was now in a full-blown standoff. The murmurs in the cabin had not died down. If anything, they had intensified. Passengers exchanging looks, some quietly recording, others openly watching to see how this would play out. A man a few seats away scoffed under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he muttered just loud enough to be heard. Another passenger, a woman in a business suit, shook her head. Her arms crossed as she leaned slightly toward her seatmate. Karoline could feel the shift. The room was no longer just waiting for an answer. It was expecting one. The supervisor took a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing against her as she considered her response. She had been in this job long enough to know that this was a no-win scenario. If she sided with the first attendant and asked Karoline to remove her necklace, the already restless passengers would see it for what it was, an unjust, targeted demand with no legitimate backing. If she overruled her colleague, she risked undermining her own crew's authority in front of the entire cabin, but it was already too late for neutrality. The moment the first flight attendant had singled out Karoline, the situation had become bigger than a simple request. She turned back to Karoline, her voice carefully measured. "You're welcome to wear your necklace, Miss Leavitt." The decision landed like a thunderclap. A few passengers let out audible murmurs of approval. The first flight attendant's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the supervisor's expression made it clear that this discussion was over. The silence that followed was not the kind of silence that diffused tension. It was the kind that cemented the damage already done. Karoline didn't need to say anything. The moment had already spoken for itself. The first flight attendant hesitated, fingers curling against the tray she held, her shoulders stiff as she forced herself to step back. She had lost, and worse, she had lost in front of an audience that had already made up its mind. Across the aisle, a man raised his phone just enough to make it obvious he was still recording. "This is unbelievable," another passenger muttered under his breath, shaking his head. A sharper voice followed. "If she weren't conservative, would this even be happening?" The question cut through the cabin like a blade. That was the real issue, wasn't it? It was never about airline policy. It was never about passenger discomfort. It was about the assumption that certain people, certain beliefs, could be pushed just a little harder, that they wouldn't push back. But this time someone had. The supervisor, clearly aware that this had already spiraled beyond her control, straightened her posture and gave a carefully measured nod. "Let's get you a drink, Miss Leavitt, on the house." The attempt at smoothing things over only highlighted how badly they had fumbled. Karoline didn't need their free drink. She had already won. And the first flight attendant knew it too. She moved stiffly, her once confident presence reduced to cautious, measured steps. She was avoiding eye contact now, her body language speaking louder than any apology ever could. She was waiting to see just how far this would go. And then it happened. A chime rang through the cabin, signaling the airline's in-flight Wi-Fi had just gone live. A moment later, a notification buzzed on Karoline's phone, then another, and another. Somewhere the story had already hit the internet. She tapped her screen. A conservative news site had already picked up the video clip, the caption blunt, cutting straight to the heart of the issue. "Christian woman harassed mid-flight over her faith. You won't believe what happened next." And the comments. They were flooding in. "This is what we're up against, folks. They won't even let us exist in peace. Unreal. I hope this flight attendant gets what's coming to her. Karoline, you're a warrior. Stand strong." The momentum was unstoppable now. She glanced toward the first flight attendant, who was speaking in hushed tones with the supervisor, her body language stiff with unease. She knew that her actions had just ignited something she could no longer contain. By the time the plane landed, this wouldn't just be a heated argument at 300 feet. It would be a headline. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed from quiet luxury to a space charged with tension, disbelief, and the growing realization that this moment was spiraling into something much bigger than a simple exchange between a flight attendant and a passenger. The moment the supervisor ruled that Karoline Leavitt was allowed to wear her cross, a shift took place. Not just in authority, but in perception. The passengers weren't just witnessing an interaction anymore. They were participants in an unfolding controversy that, whether they wanted to or not, was becoming bigger than the four walls of this plane. Conversations that had once been hushed whispers had now become open discussions. Some passengers leaned in toward their seatmates, murmuring their opinions, while others had pulled out their phones, recording discreetly, some not even bothering to hide what they were doing. The murmurs grew, a steady hum of voices threading through the air, feeding into the energy that had overtaken the cabin. It was no longer just about Karoline. It was about what this moment represented. A man across the aisle let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. "So you really tried to police someone's faith in first class," he muttered, not directly addressing the flight attendant, but making sure his voice carried just enough for others to hear. Another passenger, a woman seated 2 rows ahead, turned slightly and looked directly at Karoline before glancing back at the flight crew, her eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her voice laced with disapproval. The first flight attendant, who had initiated the confrontation, stood rigid, her hands gripping the serving tray so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She could hear the shift in tone, the murmur of discontent that was no longer contained. She had lost the room. And then, as if on cue, the first voice of direct defiance cut through the tension. You wouldn't have said a damn thing if it was a different religious symbol. The voice belonged to a man sitting in business class, his laptop still open on the tray table in front of him. He didn't turn to face the flight attendant, didn't gesture wildly or raise his voice unnecessarily. He simply spoke the words as if stating an indisputable fact. And the way the murmurs swelled in agreement told Karoline that he wasn't alone in his thinking. Another passenger, a woman dressed in business attire, turned her head slightly and let out a small nod. "That's the real issue, isn't it?" she said to no one in particular, but the pointedness of her words made it clear she was speaking to everyone. The first flight attendant's jaw tightened. Karoline could see the conflict in her expression, the realization that she had pushed too far, but also the refusal to back down completely. She had expected this to be a quick moment of control, a quiet request, a small show of authority that would be met with compliance, maybe some irritation, but ultimately submission. She hadn't expected to be challenged so openly, and now, with eyes locked onto her from every direction, she was out of moves. But the passengers weren't done yet. A younger woman, probably in her early 30s, glanced toward the aisle where another flight attendant was standing frozen, clearly unsure of how to intervene. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "is this airline going to have an official stance on religious jewelry, or is it just case by case, depending on whether the flight crew personally approves of someone's faith?" There was an edge to her voice, not loud, not aggressive, but cutting in its precision. She wasn't just questioning the policy, she was exposing the arbitrariness of the entire situation. The murmurs grew louder. The passengers weren't just passively reacting anymore, they were pushing back. One of the men across the aisle, still holding up his phone, cleared his throat. "You mind saying that a little louder for the recording?" he asked, his voice a mix of sarcasm and barely veiled challenge. The first flight attendant stiffened, her eyes darting toward the supervisor, looking for an escape, looking for backup, but there was none. The supervisor, who had already made her decision, wasn't going to bail her out. The weight of the moment pressed into the space between them. The power dynamics that had once seemed tilted in favor of the flight crew had flipped entirely. The passengers weren't just reacting to the confrontation, they were shaping the outcome. The supervisor, sensing how far things had spiraled, took a slow breath, her voice measured as she tried one last time to diffuse the situation. "Let's all try to move on from this misunderstanding," she said, her tone carefully even. "Miss Leavitt is welcome to wear her necklace, and we will make sure that all passengers feel comfortable." But it was too late for neutral statements. The damage had already been done. The flight attendant who had initiated the confrontation gave a curt nod, but it was not the nod of someone in control. It was the nod of someone who knew she had lost. She took a half step back, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if wishing she could disappear entirely, and yet the moment continued to stretch, linger, refusing to fade. Someone muttered under their breath, just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear, "First class doesn't mean first class treatment, huh?" It was a casual comment, almost offhand, but it carried the weight of every person who had ever been treated differently for their beliefs, every person who had ever been told they had to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. Karoline, still seated, still calm, let out a small exhale. She didn't need to say anything. The passengers were speaking for her now, and as the murmurs continued, the flight crew scrambling to regain some semblance of order, it became clear that the real impact of this moment wouldn't be felt until after they landed. The flight had yet to take off, but the story had already taken flight in an entirely different way. The moment the in-flight Wi-Fi connected, the passengers who had been recording wasted no time. Within minutes, the first clip surfaced online, a 27-second video capturing the exact moment the flight attendant told Karoline Leavitt her cross necklace might make some passengers uncomfortable. It wasn't just the words that caught people's attention. It was the way it unfolded. The condescending tone, the forced politeness barely masking the authority behind the request. The sharp contrast between the attendant's expectation of compliance and Karoline's unwavering refusal. And then, the shift. The murmurs of the passengers, the man's voice cutting through with his pointed challenge, the visible unease in the flight crew as they realized they had lost control. The clip, uploaded to a conservative news page, carried a blunt, cutting caption, "Christian woman harassed mid-flight over her faith." You won't believe what happened next. And just like that, the internet took over. Karoline hadn't even looked at her phone yet, but the notifications were already rolling in, one after another. Within minutes, thousands of views. The comment section exploded with outrage, support, and calls for action. This is what we're up against, folks. They won't even let us exist in peace. Unreal. Since when is wearing a cross offensive? This flight attendant needs to be held accountable. Boycott this airline. Karoline, you're a warrior. Stand strong. The momentum was unstoppable. From somewhere in the back of the cabin, another chime rang out as yet another passenger connected to the Wi-Fi, likely seeing the video for the first time. The domino effect had begun. It wasn't just conservative commentators picking up the clip. It was everyday people, passengers from all walks of life, sharing, commenting, engaging. Meanwhile, in first class, the flight attendant who had started it all had realized her mistake. She was still working, still moving through the cabin, but something had changed. She avoided eye contact with Karoline, with the passengers who had spoken out, with the phone still discreetly angled in her direction. She knew this wasn't just an awkward moment that would pass once the flight landed. She had ignited something far bigger than she could contain. The supervisor, sensing the growing storm, stood off to the side, typing something rapidly into her company-issued tablet. A report, no doubt. Damage control before the headlines got ahead of them. But it was too late. The headlines were already writing themselves in real time. Karoline finally glanced at her phone. The video had over 500 views already. And that was just the beginning. The flight attendant moved stiffly down the aisle, her once confident stride now reduced to hesitant, measured steps. She kept her gaze forward, avoiding the eyes of passengers who were no longer just customers but witnesses, active participants in a moment that had spiraled beyond her control. The hum of quiet conversation still filled the cabin, but it was different now. There was no returning to normal, no undoing what had already happened. The moment she had confronted Karoline Leavitt, the moment she had suggested her cross necklace was somehow inappropriate, she had unknowingly set off a chain reaction she couldn't stop. The viral video spreading across social media was proof of that. Karoline didn't need to say anything. The passengers were speaking for her. The man in business class who had called out the double standard, the woman who had demanded the airline clarify its stance on religious expression, the growing murmurs of frustration. They had flipped the script entirely. The first-class cabin, once an arena where the flight crew dictated the rules, had become a space where the authority of the airline was now under question. The supervisor stood nearby, her company-issued tablet in hand, rapidly typing, likely drafting an internal report before the story spun further out of their control. She had already sided with Karoline, but that decision hadn't been made out of principle. It had been damage control, an attempt to contain the situation before it escalated even further. But it had already escalated. The flight attendant knew it too. Every small movement betrayed her unease. The slight clench of her jaw, the way her hands gripped the serving tray a little too tightly, the flicker of frustration in her eyes as she tried to maintain composure. She wasn't just flustered, she was panicked. The notifications on Karoline's phone kept rolling in. The video that had first surfaced barely 20 minutes ago had already amassed over 1,000,000 views. And the comments? Brutal. This flight attendant needs to be fired. Boycott this airline. I'll never fly with them again. Religious freedom is under attack, and this is proof. Why does a Christian woman have to justify wearing a cross in America? Karoline glanced up just in time to catch the first flight attendant whispering in hushed tones to another crew member, her expression tight with worry. She had miscalculated badly, and she knew it. The fallout had already begun. By the time the plane landed, this wouldn't just be a heated mid-flight exchange, it would be a national conversation. As the plane began its descent, Karoline Leavitt remained steady, her posture unchanged despite the whirlwind of events that had unfolded around her. She didn't need to check her phone to know that the moment had already gone far beyond this flight. The weight of what had happened hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The passengers had seen it, had felt it, and now, so had the world. The first flight attendant, once firm in her misplaced authority, was visibly shaken, her earlier confidence replaced by tense, calculated movements. She avoided looking at Karoline, avoided looking at the passengers who had stood up against her demand, as if acknowledging them would make the situation even more real. But the damage had already been done. She had lost control. And now, the world was watching. Karoline glanced at her phone, the screen lighting up with notifications too fast to keep up with. The first viral video, the one capturing the exact moment the flight attendant asked her to remove her necklace, had already surpassed 200,000 views. More clips had surfaced, different angles, different passengers sharing their perspectives. Conservative media had picked it up instantly, but it wasn't just them. Everyday people, those who had never heard of her before today, were watching, commenting, reacting, and the message was clear. People weren't just upset about what had happened. They were furious. Why is a Christian being singled out for her faith? This isn't just about Karoline. This is about all of us. Religious freedom means everyone gets to express their faith, not just the ones society approves of. This flight attendant knew exactly what she was doing, and she should be held accountable. The support was pouring in, not just from conservatives, not just from Christians, but from anyone who had ever felt silenced, anyone who had ever been told to shrink themselves, to make someone else comfortable. That's what this moment was really about. It was bigger than a necklace, bigger than one flight. It was about who gets to exist openly and who is expected to hide. Karoline exhaled slowly, glancing toward the front of the plane where the supervisor was still typing furiously on her tablet. Damage control was already in full swing. The airline would have to respond. They couldn't ignore this. But no corporate statement, no pre-packaged apology could erase what had already happened. The people had seen it with their own eyes. As the wheels touched the runway, the shift in the air was palpable. The first-class passengers who had been silent at the beginning of the flight were now engaged, exchanging glances, quietly acknowledging what they had just witnessed. As the plane taxied to the gate, a man from business class met Karoline's gaze and gave her a small but firm nod. Another passenger, a woman who had been quietly typing away on her laptop, leaned over and whispered, "We're with you." She didn't need to say anything in return. They already knew. By the time she stepped off the plane, Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding her ground, she was becoming a movement. As Karoline Leavitt stepped off the plane, she knew the moment had already grown beyond her. This wasn't just about a single flight or an overzealous flight attendant enforcing an unwritten rule. This was about something deeper, something that had been boiling beneath the surface for a long time. The conversation was no longer just about her necklace. It was about who gets to openly express their beliefs and who is expected to suppress them. It was about a growing sense that some expressions of faith were celebrated while others were subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, discouraged. And now, because of this one moment, because of a single decision to stand her ground, the world was watching. The reaction online had already exploded, far beyond expectations. Conservative voices rallied behind Karoline, calling her a symbol of resistance against the growing cultural pressure to silence certain beliefs. But it wasn't just conservative media driving the conversation. The debate spilled over into mainstream platforms, with people from all walks of life weighing in on what had happened, and more importantly, what it represented. Was this truly an isolated incident? Or was it part of a larger trend? One where certain views were being subtly policed under the guise of inclusivity and comfort. The sheer speed with which the video spread suggested that many people had felt this way before, but had never seen such a clear, undeniable example play out so publicly. News outlets scrambled to cover the situation, each spinning the narrative in different ways. Some painted Karoline as a victim of religious discrimination, a woman who had been targeted simply for wearing a symbol of her faith. Others attempted to downplay the incident, suggesting that it had been blown out of proportion, that it was a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate attempt to single her out. But no matter how they framed it, they couldn't change the fact that the footage spoke for itself. The flight attendant hadn't just asked Karoline to remove her necklace. She had done so in a way that made it clear she believed she had the authority to make that request. And that's what unsettled so many people. The implications stretched far beyond a single airline policy or an individual flight crew member's actions. The larger cultural debate unfolding in real time was about power, control, and the shifting boundaries of personal expression. If a cross necklace could be seen as offensive, what else could be deemed inappropriate next? Where was the line between respecting different perspectives and actively suppressing one side to appease another? For many, this wasn't just about religious freedom. It was about a broader cultural shift that seemed to demand conformity under the guise of inclusivity. The irony wasn't lost on the thousands of commenters who pointed out that true inclusivity should mean allowing people to live openly with their faith, not forcing them to hide it to make others comfortable. The argument wasn't about forcing religious expression on anyone. It was about whether certain beliefs were being quietly pushed out of the public sphere, while others were upheld as untouchable. And Karoline's moment, a seemingly small encounter at 300 feet, had suddenly become the flashpoint for that conversation. By the time the airline released its first public statement, the damage had already been done. The public perception was set. People had already made up their minds. And in an era where cultural battles play out just as much on social media as in policy rooms, perception was everything. What happened on that flight wasn't just a personal stand. It became a cultural moment. And as Karoline walked through the terminal, greeted by the steady buzz of her phone and the knowing nods of strangers who had seen the footage, one thing was clear. This debate wasn't ending anytime soon. The incident involving Karoline Leavitt is more than just a viral controversy. It is a profound reminder of the importance of standing firm in one's beliefs, the power of quiet resilience, and the undeniable influence of everyday moments that turn into cultural touchstones. For many seniors, this story resonates on a deeper level because they have lived through decades of change. Times when values, traditions, and expressions of faith were not only accepted, but encouraged, only to now witness a world where those same expressions are increasingly questioned, scrutinized, or even discouraged. The lesson here is clear. When faced with pressure to compromise who you are, the most powerful response is to stand firm, not with anger, not with outrage, but with calm certainty. In today's world, there is an ever-growing push to conform, to keep certain beliefs hidden for the sake of inclusivity or comfort. But the reality is that true inclusivity should mean allowing everyone to express their values freely, without fear of backlash or judgment. This moment on an airplane, seemingly small, highlights a larger cultural trend that many have felt but few have been able to articulate. Certain perspectives, particularly those tied to faith and tradition, are being slowly pushed out of public spaces under the guise of neutrality. But silence is not neutrality, it is erasure. And this is where the importance of courage and conviction comes into play. Seniors, more than anyone, understand that real strength isn't about how loud you argue, but how steady you remain in the face of adversity. Karoline's response was not one of panic or emotional outburst. She did not demand sympathy or lash out in frustration. Instead, she stood her ground calmly, clearly, and with confidence. And that, more than anything, is what turned the tide in her favor. It is a lesson that applies to all aspects of life. People will challenge your beliefs, they will question your values, and they may even try to push you into submission. But if you remain unshaken, if you refuse to waver, you have already won. Furthermore, this story reveals the power of collective action. Karoline may have been the one targeted, but it was the support of those around her, the passengers who spoke up, the man who asked the pointed question, the growing murmurs of discontent, that ultimately shifted the balance of power. This is a reminder that silence is compliance, but speaking up, even in small ways, creates real change. Many seniors have spent their lives instilling values in their families, in their communities, and in the workplaces they built. This moment is a call to continue doing so, to remind younger generations that principles are not meant to be hidden, but upheld. At its core, this event teaches us that respect is a two-way street. If society demands tolerance for some beliefs while silencing others, that is not fairness, it is control. True fairness means allowing everyone to live out their convictions without fear. For those who have spent a lifetime witnessing the slow erosion of certain freedoms, this moment is a stark reminder that history belongs to those who refuse to back down. So, whether in a conversation with family, a debate in a community setting, or even an everyday moment like sitting on a plane, remember this: the way to preserve what matters is not through force, but through unwavering conviction. Karoline didn't just protect her right to wear a cross, she reminded the world that standing firm is still the most powerful statement of all.